Kelsey, welcome. Jake, thank you for being here with us today.
Good to be here.
And I think it is timely that we are discussing being good neighbors today. Kelsey, if you'll unmute yourself, I'd love to be able to chat with you and Jake, and Todd. Todd, I know you're on almost right on the ground in Minneapolis with the recent protest and stuff like that. I too have been on the ground in Glenn County with Ahmaud Arbery. So Kelsey, tell me where you're located at.
I'm in Mounds View, Minnesota.
So you're right in the thick of things going on right now too, I'm assuming. How far are you from Minneapolis?
Like 10 minutes.
Yeah, you are. You are. So it's amazing how God, I guess, works. Today we're going to be talking about being the best neighbors, and especially in this time of not only COVID-19, but also all the recent race issues that have become heightened. They were already there, but have certainly become heightened because of police and authority that they think they have and just abuse. So before we get started, let's say a prayer. Dear God, thank you so much for gathering us online as we continue to discuss growing young and what that means in our congregations. I ask that you guide us today in our conversations. Help us to see the direction that you want for us to go. And especially today, we ask that you help us to be the best neighbors possible. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Jake, would you just share where you're located at too?
Yes, I can, and I'm trying to figure out, if I do this, can you see me or not?
Yep.
Yep.
All right. Am I the only one with my video on right now?
You are.
Okay. And are we trying to keep it that way?
We can open it up, I think, if you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's on the left side of my control panel. Hey, there's Rachel. All right, now it feels like there's actually some people here. This is great. Yeah, mine's right below my microphone. Now I feel like
Let me see if I can get back to the PowerPoint, but
oh yeah, that's right. Well, I don't want to mess you up. I'm gonna put headphones on so there's not much background. You said, sorry, introduce myself, Rachel.
yeah, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I'm Jake Mulder. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So I guess right over the lake from those of you who are in, excuse me, Minnesota. I work for Fuller Theological Seminary, the Fuller Youth Institute, and I think my connection to this conversation is having led the research and co-authored the book that we're talking about on growing young, and thinking about, in this case, yeah, what does it mean for us to neighbor well, to do justice and everything going on right now in this world.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that, thank you, Jake, thanks for being here. So it's fun to work with you.
You as well.
So let's get started. I like to say this is, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So for me, this is one of the things that our church, I feel like, does well. Of all of the 6 strategies, I think we do, we can always do better, but we do a really good job of growing your neighbor. One of the activities that the book shared with us was to walk around your church. And I was thinking, since COVID-19, most of us have not been walking around our churches. And to visually think about that, especially as we begin to reopen and go back, what that's going to look like is going to be really, can be really helpful. The other thing about being our best neighbors is I think our older generations in our congregations have taken this seriously. Many of them participate in one or more service or mission opportunities in their congregations. Even my little mother, who is 82 years old, has a letter writing campaign, and she writes notes and cards. For some reason, the older generations have been able to be good neighbors. And I've seen that in congregations that I've served at, and seen that in congregations across the ELCA. Kelsey, what's your experience been with that?
What was the question exactly? Sorry.
Well, just, generations in your church, how is your church doing being a good neighbor?
We've been actually talking a lot about intergenerational like worship services and service opportunities and really striving to have more of those. We found that it is difficult having the really little kids and older adults kind of have the same takeaway from different events. So it's been bridging that gap of how can we serve everyone best, and realize that at one point you can't always do that in one setting, that sometimes it does need to be broken down a little bit because the little kids need busy things. They need their hands on something, where the older generation, they're fine kicking back and listening to the music or worshiping and things like that. But we're striving to continue to work on that and figure out different events, which obviously have changed greatly with COVID-19, where our church is not meeting at all throughout June and possibly the whole summer. We're waiting to find out on that, but yeah.
Right. I can understand definitely how to planning events for intergenerational activities can sometimes be difficult. So what is your congregation doing to serve? I hate to put you on the spot. Todd, if you'll chime in too, what are your congregations doing to be good neighbors right now? What are you doing looking outside your doors, outside your windows?
Yeah, so as a staff and council, we spent time, especially at the beginning of COVID-19 and social distancing, to reach out to everyone in our congregation. So we took a chunk of the phone list and called them to check in and wrote down if there's any prayer requests, any needs, and just touch base with everyone that way. Then right now, with everything happening in the cities, we are doing different drives for specific items that are needed within that area. And then our service outreach person is coordinating getting all the donations down there. So making sure that everything is still socially distant and people are wearing masks and participating in that sense. Then I work mostly with youth, and we're plugging away doing online things for our youth and trying to keep them involved in that manner.
Mm-hmm. Have any of them been involved with any of the protest or walk-ins or service opportunities?
Some of them have, and it's very tricky because we want to respect people and the social distancing, where it's this toss-up of, I have someone at home that has asthma, so I physically can't go down there.
Yep.
Because I don't want to put them at more risk. And so there's this want and need in our community to help and to lift up those that need it, but also making sure that we're taking care of our health too. So we've seen a lot of that. So then by opening the door, it's saying, hey, we're collecting donations that we brought down to this area that is basically in a food desert. And people have really outpoured that. We had 5 carloads of items going down within 24 hours of putting the word out.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah,
that's great. Responding immediately is so important, and that really brings our the next slide up, that being a good neighbor is looking outside anything that takes place outside your doors, looking out into the world, and recognizing the culture, what's happening right at this moment, whether it's values, ideas, the needs, the politics, and responding right away. So your congregation, it sounds like, is doing a fantastic job of that. Todd, how about your congregation? Not, it doesn't have to be just COVID-19 or or everything that's happening in Minneapolis right now, but it could be other things too as well.
Sure. And right now, I think it's easiest to point to some of the things that are happening in Minneapolis and some of the things that are happening around COVID-19 and such, because of social distancing, there's not a lot of other things. I mean, we're doing some pieces with funding and stuff like that with our community partners, but it's really hard to figure out how to send people out to serve when we're being told we shouldn't send anybody anywhere. And so we did a similar thing as Kelsey. We're collecting items. Actually, we were at Synodical drop site, and then we trucked stuff up to Minneapolis on Friday last week. It was an amazing experience to be there and be in the midst of that. Kelsey used the phrase "food desert," and that's really right. We were in the parking lot of a large grocery store that had been looted and was closed, and so it was. That's where food was being distributed from, but that was the only grocery store for a couple square miles. So we unloaded there and assisted a little bit and such. But we're trying to. We had a conversation at a staff meeting this morning about how do we connect in the community when we don't know. With our, we're an active partner with our food shelf and the clothing bank and a lot of those organizations, but they aren't taking volunteers because of social distancing and such, or they aren't using people in the same way they have in the past. And so we're trying to have to create new pathways for how we connect and how we support and what that looks like. And that's kind of exciting because it helps us think differently. But at the same time, it's a challenge because we have to try to connect people and their gifts up with needs that are suddenly very different than they were, 3 months ago. So.
Sure. One of the statements by one of the, oh good, I can actually see you guys. One of the, I clicked a button and it was like, wow, there are my friends. I love this quote by Tim Keller: all churches must understand, love, and identify with their local community and social setting, and yet at the same time be able and willing to critique and challenge it. I certainly think right now with COVID-19 as well as Minneapolis and race relations across the world, this is the time for the church to rise up. I think God's giving us a wonderful opportunity right now, not only to serve, but also to critique and to challenge. Those second words, or the last of that statement, really stands out now more this time around when I read the book and this chapter than ever before. So how does your church tackle tough issues, whether it be cultural issues or community issues? I wonder, is there a process that your church does, or is it, I would have to say my little congregation does a quick powwow when things happen rather than a special, and everyone seems to come together when there's when there's a difficult issue. What is the processes in your congregations?
Tell me what give me some more specifics of what you're thinking about, Rachel.
Yeah, so let's just say there is a suicide in your neighborhood or in your town. If there is, you realize that there is homeless issues or food shortages, what is the process that your church works through to make those, to help be better neighbors?
So we actually have a director of serving ministries that leads the way with that. That way there's always one point person, and she coordinates between the organization and what is happening within our congregation to bridge that gap and rally volunteers within our congregation to help out. Like right now we've been taking donations down to Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Minneapolis or in St. Paul. So she's been organizing the drivers for that, organizing the pickup times at church where people can drop things off. And I think whenever there's something that comes up in our area where there is a need, she's the go-to of getting that kind of facilitated. And then we are her minions in a way to help out in any way that we can.
So is she the only person that's part of the process, or there are others that are part of the process?
She's the point person, but she has many others that are involved within it. So if there's something like last Thursday, we had a drive-through schools through for our youth and their families, and we teamed up with her to gather supplies at that. So we encourage people to come grab a breakfast, say hi from a distance, drop off some goods that could be brought down to St. Paul, Minneapolis area. And that was that. So it was team effort in many ways, but
yeah. And I was wondering how young people were involved in that process. So that's great.
Yeah, we had a lot of the youth show up with things of toilet paper and paper towel and whatever they could find. So
yeah, there was a shortage and now there's not, right?
right.
Are any of the young people involved in or work with her just on making decisions about things that the church needs to tackle?
Not necessarily. If they have an idea or something, they'll talk to either myself or my other children, youth, and family coworkers, and then we can help kind of direct and point in the right way. Or if our serving person has an idea or they have a need for more youth or we want to do something, then we team up together.
Awesome.
To help initiate.
Great process. Great process. Todd, you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had different kinds of things that come up. Actually, what's been probably one of the pressing issues for us in the last year and a half has been issues around race in our community. We've had a couple different incidents happen that were kind of spark igniter kind of events that created tension, long before the George Floyd stuff happened. And it's been good because the schools have really taken an active role here in trying to draw the community together. To some extent, local government and some of those kinds of things just chose to not engage it. But our school district has really been kind of the ones to draw people together. We have a wonderful superintendent. And so he's initiated some things that happen in the schools where really created platforms for conversations, and the churches have engaged at that level. Different events called Better Together events that have taken place throughout the community over the course of a year. But he would be the first to identify, and I agree with this, that it was actually young people in the schools saying, we're ready to talk about this. When are the adults going to be ready to talk about this? And so I think it's been young people in the community that have been kind of, to some extent, driving some of those conversations. And really, I think our youth staff and folks in the church community has been just to kind of, our goal has been to kind of gather around and support that process, and let them lead when there's been opportunities for them to lead. Interestingly, we've had 2 protests in Owatonna in the last 2 weekends around the George Floyd piece, both of which were organized by a high schooler. And there's good and bad in that, and kind of how some of those things played out. But overall, it's been a good thing.
Yeah, I think young people are really finding their voice around this racism issue because, particularly Generation Z is the generation that is the most diverse, the most multicultural that the United States has ever seen.
Mhm.
So, and helping them find that voice and guide them, I think is going to have to be a priority for our church, and certainly will help us grow young, because if the church takes a stand on these issues, or is even a place to have these difficult conversations, it's in the book, it also mentions on-ramps, and this is a primary great on-ramp right now for conversations to bring people together, especially in our neighbors who are concerned, and youth and young adults that are concerned about the racism issue. The book describes what a congregation looks like, who is a good neighbor, our best neighbor. They say that congregation honors what is good, that they strive to make their world, and when I say their world, it's their neighbor, their community, a better place. They are patient with their neighbors. So we all know that this racism issue is going to be a long journey. But as long as we respect and honor and walk with one another, we will get through it, and we will bring others along with us. Courageous neighbors embrace ethnic diversity, and I will say the ELCA struggles with this. And I'm not even I don't understand exactly why, except for it. But we do in some areas of our country in regards to welcoming others that look different than us and people of color. Even yesterday, I was on a conversation and painfully heard a Black woman share that she has not always felt welcome in our church. And in one way, we have to figure out a way to embrace ethnic diversity. This is another goal that Domestic Mission, that our church will be focusing on in the coming years. And so I think the Growing Young book shows us that not only will embracing help us grow young, but also grow diverse. Jake, do you have any comments on that? And if not, that's okay.
No, I'm just trying to find my unmute button. I could comment on so many pieces of this because it's such an important topic. Rachel, which piece would you like me to zero in on first, though?
Oh, I was just thinking about the ethnic diversity, because and socioeconomic diversity too. Both of those are, I think, the ELCA sometimes struggles with. Yeah.
So I think we write about this in the book, but one of the pieces that I want to zero in on that I think is important for the ELCA and is important for all of us as Christians is just going back to, it's easy to make social justice or good neighboring an issue, a topic, something that's somehow disconnected from everything else that we're doing. I would actually like to take it back to the very core of the conversation of what it means to be Christian, which is what does it mean to be created in the image of God, right? Truly, what does it mean that we are children of God, that we're created in the image of God? And I can relate to some aspects of the ELCA. I myself come from a Dutch Reformed heritage. So my family goes back generations in Holland, the country, which was a very white reality, which was a very Dutch kind of nationalistic sort of story. Growing up, when I thought, what does it mean to be a Christian? My sense of, well, being made in the image of God means you're white and you're middle class and you're Dutch, because that's who I was surrounded by. And it was, you know, as I got later into high school, as I get into college, beyond, that I started to unpack all these different realities of what does it actually mean to be made in the image of God, and that we're all God's children together. So I think that would be my initial comment, is just this stuff goes back to be so core to who we are and what it even means for us to walk and live out our faith. I can go further that direction, but I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you. Our youth did a Bible study, or has been doing a Bible study on Wednesday nights, called Candle Time, and we looked at the creation story. And as you said, we are created in God's image. And in Genesis 2, it not only said, each creation piece, in the biblical narrative, it says, and it was good. But when it comes to creating people, it says it was very good. And our youth really keyed in on that for some reason, the writers thought that word very, or most, or whatever it would have been in original terminology, was important. So anyway, I think this is a place where the ELCA has got to do some work. But that's we're always at work. That is really, for me, the last chapter of the book. There's certainly tons more that we could discuss there, but Jake, I know we're going to be running out on time. I want to go back to the 6 core commitments. We talked about key chain leadership and passing on those keys to younger leaders. We talked about empathy, listening to one another, and keeping our mouths shut sometimes and just listening to what others have to say, and truly trying to understand the needs of our young people. We talked about our message should be Jesus's message of love and grace, and love your neighbor, and tell the stories of Jesus. We talked about warm relationships and how to develop those in our congregations. We talked about prioritizing everywhere, that young people should be involved in every single part of your congregation, whether it's serving in the kitchen, whether it's serving on Sunday mornings, whether it's preaching. Young people should be prioritized everywhere. And then finally, today we talked about being the best neighbors and what that means in our community, especially today. So I'd like to ask, if you were to have to start on a core commitment today in your congregation, what would be the one that you would want to begin working on? Todd, I'll start with you.
Whoop, still muted there, Todd.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm actually trying to enlarge your screen so I can see the visual a little bigger.
Can I do it better? Should I try and do it better?
Or I just got to get better glasses, one of the two.
Oh.
So the question is, where do we feel like we can be doing better?
Well, no, if you were going to start today on a growing young, one of the strategies, which one would you start with?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. again, I'm having a hard time seeing here, so I'm sorry I'm not able to. Actually, I see the circle and I can't read the words that are inside it because on my screen it's too small. But I think right now, just given, everything just feels really fluid, and so things are changing. You look at where the world is at and our context at any given moment. I think for us, the question around the neighbor thing is where I would start, given what's going on right now. In the world around us. I mean, I think all of them are valid and all of them work and all of them are important. But as I look at this, that's the one where my eye is immediately drawn, because that's the question that exists. And I think in our community, I would look at that. I would look at the neighbors, and I'd look at the racial piece again, given the circumstances of the world, and I would take it even a different step and say we have to figure out as well some of the interfaith kinds of pieces that connect with that, because in our community, we actually have a fairly significant Native African population of people that have immigrated here from South Sudan and Tanzania and some of those neighboring countries. But a lot of those folks are also of the Muslim faith. We have an active mosque in our community, and like that's a place that we have not really been able to kind of develop, I think, a good working relationship. So there, I think the racial and the interfaith things are interconnected. And so that's how I would look at the best neighbor piece. And I think that's at the root of some of the things that we're dealing with in Owatonna.
Right. Great. Great. Kelsey, how about you?
I think I would look at empathy today and really focus on where people are at, because I mean, with COVID-19, with racial injustice and everything happening, there's so much. One of my coworkers was talking this morning at our staff meeting that she knows 2 young women that went to one of the protests when the semi came through on the highway, and now they kind of have some PTSD going on from that, and just having that empathy for what they're going through. And I mean, there's underlying things that we're all realizing throughout this time, and just being empathetic to those underlying conditions that we might not see on the surface, and helping the youth, especially in my position, kind of cope with what's happening, and looking at and recognizing that PTSD is a real thing. It's okay to have it, and it's working through it and figuring out how to best serve them.
Yes. Yep. Yep. Yeah, there's been a lot that has come out with our youth, especially with the COVID-19 and then the racism stuff too as well. But lack of sleep. I've heard about kids checking out. I mean, they're just tired of being online, tired of, and they're ready for relationships. I think we've even seen that in some ways, and they're ready for physical relationships, and understanding that that's how God built us to be. And it's hard to be caring for one another and be there for a person when it's just online with the social distancing kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So Jake, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Just overall with the growing, and thank you again so much for being online.
Yeah, have to.
With the growing young, and I'm going to get rid of my slide now. So with growing young, what have you been seeing across the United States and perhaps even across the world in regards to success stories of congregations that are growing young?
Yeah, great question. And I think part of what I'm thrilled to think about and reflect on is it's hard to pick just one because we're hearing so many. So let me talk in generality first, and then I can zero in on specifics. I think when we're seeing a church that's really growing young, one of the themes that we like to say is that they're growing young together. So often an assumption is that, oh, to grow young means we get rid of all the old people, we just bus in some younger people, and we become a church that was old and dying, and now we're a church of exclusively 20-somethings. And I think that the real beauty of it takes place when it's not one generation or the other, it's how we actually do this together as an overall community. To me, that's the win. So if the buzzword for that is intergenerational community, that's a wonderful way to think about it. But I think another win kind of theme that we're seeing is a number of churches that particularly in this season of COVID are turning to their young people, are turning to their young adults to figure out the way forward. And I think that especially when we talk about key chain leadership and empathy, there are ways that, yes, young people benefit from being part of a church that's overall supportive and caring, But there's true ways that the overall church benefits from having young people, and one of those comes to this sense of innovation and adaptation. So to give that a tangible example, we've talked to church after church after church that over the last 3 months, 6 months, few years, they've really been building into their teenagers. They've really been building into their young adults. They've been asking those groups to take on meaningful responsibility in the church. Well, what happened is when COVID rolled around and these churches were trying to figure out how to go online, and many of these were 50-person churches, 125-person churches, there was a whole skill set that many of the pastors, leadership, board didn't have to figure out how to do that. Many of them found themselves turning to those 21-year-olds, those 15-year-olds to say, hey, can you help us figure out what's the best way to do that? And we've heard some really wonderful stories of young people who are expressing, I feel like I finally had a chance to use my gifts. I feel like finally the church is stepping into a space where I am, and because of that, they've needed me. And I know it wasn't just them asking me to ask me, they really needed me to come through. So I could talk about some, specific churches and more tangible examples, but across the board, those are some of the real success stories that we've been hearing, which is a way that I think that, yes, the younger generation needs that mentoring and support from an older generation and discipleship, but there's some very practical and tangible ways that that older generation can benefit from trying to respond to changing times and changing world.
Thank you. Yeah, and a lot of and you've seen the data, Jake, a lot of our congregations are 60, 70 and older in regards to attendance wise. And sometimes even when I talk about growing young, there are some people that are like all gung-ho about it, but then they, when it comes down to really making efforts, there is some pushback. So giving away that leadership, that key chain leadership.
Yep.
How do you approach congregations that are have older members on this conversation in a great growing young in a great way without making them feel guilty and feeling like they're being pushed aside?
Yeah. First of all, I think I would be just aware of the language that you're using to introduce this to a church. And part of that means it may or may not be the best thing to call it growing young from the beginning, right? Now, if your denomination has made a decision that one of the things we want and need to do is to grow young, well, certainly, if it's advantageous to approach a local church, go ahead and call it that. We wrote the book for leaders and for leaders to understand how and why the church needs to grow young. That being said, if you were taking this to your church, I would ask the question, what is it that this church cares about? What is it that drives them? And this is where context matters, right? We don't just do everything with a broad brush. We've had leaders who bring this to their church and they call it growing young, because the church is growing old. The church needs a shock to its system, and they actually need to plant a flag and say, one of the things we're going to focus on is growing young. And in their case, that's worked and been advantageous. We've seen churches that have called this growing disciples, right? It hasn't even had young in it. It's just been, we want to grow disciples, and the grow helps with the connection to the book, so that's fine. We've had other people who don't actually formally use the book title or the book itself, but has said to the church, who do we want to be? And the church will say, we want to be a family across generations. So the picture that they paint for all of this is, how do we become a multi-generational family where grandpa and grandma are worshiping with their kids who are worshiping with their kids? If that's something that works for your church, you can still implement those core commitments, right? But it's just, I think we're in a society right now where the label that we attach to something becomes much more important, and what we go with than what the actual content of that thing is. So I think it's just being very careful of what's the label that is attached to this. And there's an author on change. His name is Ron Heifetz. He writes about adaptive change. And one of my favorite quotes that he states is, when it comes to change, you have to fail people's expectations at a rate that they can stand. Okay, I'll say it one more time. You have to fail people's expectations at a rate that they can stand. And I think it taps into our fight or flight mechanism. You know, if you push something on someone way too fast, they're either going to fight because they get angry or they're going to flee because they need to get away. So it's keeping things right at the level where people are too uncomfortable to stay the way they are, but they're not so uncomfortable that it brings out their defense mechanisms. But that doesn't happen in ELCA churches, right? Everyone's like Jesus and peaceful. And so for the other denominations who might need that advice.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to drive them away, but you've got to bring them along. Just that patient journey that we talked about today with hospitable neighbors too, as well. How long, like if a congregation, a church council adopts growing young or a different terminology as priorities, how long have you seen people, how long does it take to get to see some results?
So from what we've seen, we think you can find immediate results within a day or a week. And I truly mean that, but let me balance that from, we don't think church culture changes any faster than within 2 or 3 years. Okay, so let's maybe call it 2 or 3 weeks. Yes, you can see progress. Overall church culture tends not to change for 2 or 3 years. Let me give an example. Let's say you want to grow young and you're trying to figure out how to give young people a more visible role and you want to practice keychain leadership. One of my favorite ideas for a church that is growing older and they want to raise the profile of young people is to take some of the kids in your church and pair them with the greeters in the church. Because when I check out the average church, if I'm visiting, there's a lot of churches where the average age of the greeters is in 60s, 70s, 80s, right? It's a job many people can do. You don't have to move too much. You get to shake some hands. Well, if you have some 5-year-olds, some 7-year-olds in your church, what might it look like to actually put them in the greeting rotation? Not on their own, but you take that 7-year-old and you put them next to a 70-year-old. And when you walk into church for worship, you're greeted by that 7-year-old and 70-year-old. You've got the stability and wisdom next to the excitement, exuberance, everything that comes with it. That will make your church start to feel different from the moment that people come into it, right? Because young people are visible, they're involved, they're playing an important role. So that's something you could do next week. Probably no one would, well, I never want to underestimate a church, but most churches would not lose it over the idea of a 7-year-old joining the greeters. On the flip side of that, if you really want to become a culture that has a high view of young people, that's constantly looking for opportunities to involve them, to take them seriously, that's a very different culture and expectation than many of our churches have. If we want most of our members to get to that point where that's their default, rarely do we see significant behavior change and people really viewing young people differently and viewing a different way of being church for 2-3 years.
Awesome. Kelsey, Heather, Todd, do you have any, I feel like I've been talking head, do you have any questions for Jake?
The one thing I wonder is, Jake, so the book was written. It's a great book, by the way. I really like it. Thank you.
Thanks.
And now it's been out for a little while and people are living into this. Are there things that you've learned since the book that in terms of how things are applied or what things look like? Are there other kinds of more, I don't know if more concrete kinds of things or best practice kinds of things? You have identified some of them, but I'm curious what else you've maybe discovered or learned since the book was published and people started to live into it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'd say the focus of the book was trying to help churches shift their culture, right? So that's really what we're suggesting is you really want to be a church that forms and disciples young people. Here are changes to make in your overall church's culture, just your default way of being. I think probably one of the clearest pieces that we're learning has to do with the importance of leadership in that change process. So a lot of the things we're leaning into is, yes, it's important to empathize with young people. Yes, it's important to lean into Jesus's message. Yes, it's important to be good neighbors. Culture doesn't change automatically, and it doesn't change overnight. So I think it just doubles down on those churches that we see who make the most progress in this, either have, well, they have capable either volunteer or paid leaders or both who are able to implement this process over time. I think an analogy that I like to use is for someone who likes to work on cars or whatever you like to fix or work on, we've given you an amazing set of tools that can be utilized. Well, if you don't know how to work on or fix an engine or whatever is the piece of the car you need to work on. So I think Growing Young can be an amazing tool for those who know how to use it well, but learning how to use it well, that's leadership training and development, which is something we're trying to zero in on.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, I've got noon. If there are any other questions for Jake, ask now. Otherwise, we'll say a closing prayer. I thank you, Jake, for being online today with us. Todd, as always, thank you for hosting and making this available through the network. One of the things that's going to be happening with Growing Young is that the ELCA will have a second Train the Trainer with Jake in August, and Synod staff and leaders will be invited to participate with an online Train the Trainer event. So we are super excited about that. And then we hope that this conversation continues to happen in our congregations across the ELCA, that we are working towards growing young, and we change those statistics that many of our smaller churches especially have, and begin to go younger rather than older. The Lord be with you.
Awesome.
Dear God, thank you so much for today, for Jake. Be with us in this critical time in our nation. Let healing begin, and let it begin with you. Help us, guide us, direct us. Give us wisdom on what we should do, what we should say to bring healing across our nation. And Lord, we bring to you too the struggles that we all have with COVID-19 and being away from one another and not being able to be in the presence with one another. We ask that you find a vaccine and heal those that are ill, be with those that are dying, and especially be with the families that have lost loved ones to COVID-19. We ask that you get us through this time. Let us learn how to tackle tough decisions. Let us learn how to be good neighbors to one another. And finally, thank you for Jake, for the work that he and Kara and others have done through Fuller to inspire congregations and leaders to grow young, so that your message of your son's saving love for this world and the grace that is given to all of us is shared with every person. In all these things we pray in your son's name, amen. All
Thanks.
right.
Good to be with you.
Yep. Thank you, Jake. Thanks for jumping online with us today.
See ya.
Todd, thanks.